no option but to postpone. Over 430 people have died and thousands have been left homeless in the province. Nonhlakanipho Magwaza reports.
In a statement, Buthelezi says he was asked by Amazulu King, Misizulu Kazwelithini, to convey the request for the postponement to President Cyril Ramaphosa, who then agreed with the decision. He says the new dates will be announced after consultation with His Majesty the King, the royal family, and the President. Buthelezi further states that the royal family is also mourning the loss of 5 members of the royal family who died when their house collapsed. I'm Nonhlakanipho Magwaza for SABC News in Durban.
Deputy Cooperative Governance Minister Obed Bapela says services being rendered in terms of the newly declared state of national disaster are to soon be extended to the northwest, where the floods also caused damage and loss. Bapela says Northwest Premier Bushimape will officially write a letter to the National Department regarding the matter. Last week, President Cyril Ramaphosa declared a state of national disaster following the flooding in KZN and the Eastern Cape. Bapela has visited the flood-hit Dielpan village near Mahikeng in the northwest.
And the national technical teams will then be coming to the northwest also to join the provincial and the municipalities to further assess the damage and then the situation. But also it then becomes easier for the province then to also call for help from the National Defence Force through the net joints. The Premier will be dispatching a letter to then indicate that these are the areas that are affected. The support and the help that the community so deserve will then be expanded to the northwest affected areas.
Western Cape Premier Alan Winde has reshuffled his provincial cabinet following the resignation of one minister and the firing of another. Education MEC Debbie Schaefer will be taking an offer in the UK, while Community Safety's Albert Fritz was fired following allegations of sexual misconduct. Winde announced changes to the configuration of various departments like Human Settlements, Community Safety and Transport. The changes will see, amongst others, David Maynier as the Education Minister, while Regan Allen will become the Provincial Community Safety Minister. Winde says the aim is to improve service delivery within the restrained resources.
We want to be that Western Cape that is about action. Actions are definitely way louder than words. And I think our track record shows that. And this is that opportunity for me to say, let's make some announcements of how we are going to take this forward differently.
The murder trial of former Orlando Pirates and Bafana Bafana goalkeeper and captain Senzo Meyiwa has been adjourned until Monday at the High Court in Pretoria, when the state is expected to call its first witness. Muzi Sibiya, Bongani Ntanzi, Mthobisi Mncube, Mthokoziseni Maphisa and Sifoguhle Ntuli have pleaded not guilty to 5 counts of premeditated murder, attempted murder, robbery with aggravating circumstances, and the possession of an unlicensed firearm and ammunition. Among those lined up to give evidence are ballistic and forensic experts. Neighbors who heard gunshots outside the home of the mother of Meyiwa's girlfriend, Kelly Kumalo, in Vosloorus in 2014, are also expected to give evidence. Prosecutor George Baloyi says the state will also prove that the murder was planned at a nearby hostel.
Lead evidence, my lord, that the incident was planned at the nearby Vosloorus hostel, and a cell phone expert will testify that the signal of the robbed cell phone showed movement towards the hostel after the incident.
And finally, the World Health Organization has endorsed the use of Pfizer's oral COVID-19 antiviral treatment in high-risk patients after an analysis of trial data by the UN agency showed that the therapy dramatically cut the risk of hospitalization. The recommendation comes as thousands of people die worldwide of COVID-19 every week, despite a waning global infection rate. The WHO says of the existing COVID-19 treatments, Pfizer's Paxlovid is by far the most potent. Taking another look at your top story at 6, the coronation of the Amazulu King, Misuzulu Kazwelithini, has been postponed to a later date because of the flooding in KZN. For SAFM News, ke Modupi Makgaleme.
This Week, Today with Oliver Dickson.
It is just about 6 minutes after 6 p.m. It's a Friday. Welcome to the Friday edition, well, the only edition of the week of This Week Today. My name is Oliver Dickson, and I'm with you all the way up until the top of the hour today. Very important conversations coming up on the show today. We start off the show by asking a really important question. What will be the socio-political economic ramifications or implications of our insistence in continued use of the civil society movement to render the services and fill the vacuum and gaps that have been left by government? That is to say, why are we so comfortable as a people to give our money to organizations doing wonderful work, by the way, organizations like Gift of the Givers and other NGOs and non-profit institutions and non-governmental institutions? Why are we so willing to give them the money to do the work that government is supposed to be doing? That's to say, why do we choose not to spend that money on capacitating government, right? Corporate South Africa has come together, for instance, and in many ways donated money to fund relief, various fund relief structures, right? And you would have heard multiple interviews across the last 2 weeks, from various companies coming forward and saying, we've got this much money and we're donating this much money to here and there, and we're going to give Gift of the Givers R1 million, and we're going to give families and communities and other NGOs this much money, and we're going to help with rebuilding, and we're going to help with food parcels and housing people. And that's beautiful. That is what makes a country work, when civil society and communities come together to do these sort of things, right? But it took an interesting turn for me when a lot of the commentary that was associated with a lot of that civil society action was that we do not trust government, so we will give our money to civil society. And that's okay. There's millions of reasons to not trust the government in South Africa. But we have to ask, and pause for a moment and ask deeply, what is the continued implication of that deep level of distrust? That is an important question. Why do we not rather capacitate government? Are we creating, and here's the crux of the question, are we creating a parallel government that has not been elected? And what are the oversight and recourse structures that are available should civil society organization betray their trust? Should they be corrupt? Should they misuse funds? Should they, for instance, overpromise and underdeliver on the back of our donations, so to speak? That is one of the questions that we'll be asking in that first conversation. Second conversation we'll be having, critically important as well. You would have heard on the news over the last couple of days that there's been a sharp spike in COVID-19 numbers. I think yesterday we had over 4,000 cases or so, and the day before that we had just over 2,000 cases. So that number would have doubled. And the day before that we had about 800 cases or so. So there's a sharp doubling over the last few days of our COVID-19 positive test numbers, right? And so there are early fears of a resurgence, and we've been warned about this fifth wave, so to speak, that's coming about. Important question is, how do we deal with the epidemiological impact of what would be the fifth wave, but generally speaking going forward, especially in the interim now till we wait for the health regulations to get gazetted and approved? How do we deal in the interim with the epidemiological threat of COVID-19 without a disaster management act to fall back on? Yes, it was reinstated, but for an entirely different reason. It was reinstated to respond to the KZN disaster, not to respond to COVID-19. And there was a very specific way in which the Disaster Management Act was configured to deal with COVID-19. It's not, the configuration is vastly different to how it is dealing with the KZN disaster, for instance. And then finally on the show, we're going to have a conversation about what's happening in France, an important election happening there, perhaps the most important election France has had in the last century, and that is the face-off between Emmanuel Macron as well as Marine Le Pen, who is a right-wing candidate, so to speak. What is the implication, or what will be the implication of that election for the global south, and what does that do for geopolitical peace in the global north and around the world, specifically with what's happening in Ukraine? France is an incredibly powerful country, and it's important that we ask that question. It is a permanent member. It is a top 5 member with veto power on the United Nations Security Council. It was at the beck and call of France that countries like Mali got humanitarian aid, for instance, from the European Union. And it's important that we have a reflection on what that election means and how we should relate to it as the global South. France is a major trade partner to South Africa. Marine Le Pen's victory, if it does happen, would have a serious implication on that sort of relationship. That's what's coming up on the show. I do want you to engage with me throughout the program. We've got various ways for you to do that. You can, and I do prefer you send us a voice note on the WhatsApp line. The number there is 061 4104 107. 061 4104 107. You can also tweet me direct at Oliver_speaking. That's on Twitter, Oliver Dickson on Facebook, or you can simply find me on our SAFM platforms. That is SAFM Radio on Twitter, SAFM Radio on Facebook. The show is also being streamed live across Facebook, across YouTube, as well as Twitter. So if you're watching the show live on any of those platforms, thank you so much for tuning in and being with us. You can engage us on those live stream platforms. As you know, the show will be live streamed every week, and you can watch it and watch it back, by the way, after the fact if you missed anything or want to share a particular conversation or segment with a friend, a colleague, a loved one, or whatever the case may be. So yeah, do find us on YouTube. It is simply SAFM Radio. On YouTube, you can just search that and you'll find the live stream over there. All of that and more is coming up on the show for you right after this.
SAFM has signed a code of conduct that is enforced by the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. Under the code, we are committed to giving news that is accurate, comment that is fair, and programming that is not harmful, does not amount to hate speech, or contain violence or explicit sex. If you think we are not living up to that code, then you can inform the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. Direct any complaints in writing to the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. PO Box 142365. Craig Hall 2024. Fax to 011-326-3198 or an email to bccsa@nabsa.co.za. For more information, please visit www.bccsa.co.za. Freedom Month. Government is calling on everyone to use the Freedom Month and Freedom Day celebrations to pull together over the coming weeks and months as the country embarks on a vaccination program. Let us continue to fight the virus while striving for a return to our normal way of life. SAFM celebrates Freedom Month. This week, today, Fridays, 6 to 7 p.m. SAFM has signed a code of conduct that is enforced by the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. Under the code, we are committed to giving news that is accurate, comment that is fair, and programming that is not harmful, does not amount to hate speech, or contain violence or explicit sex. If you think we are not living up to that code, then you can inform the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. Direct any complaints in writing to the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. PO Box 142365. Craig Hall 2024. Fax to 011-326-3198 or an email to bccsa@nabsa.co.za. For more information, please visit www.bccsa.co.za. Across South Africa, online and on radio. SAFM, let's talk.
It is just about 15 minutes after 6 p.m. It is a Friday, so you are listening to This Week Today. My name is Oliver Dickson. In our first conversation today, we asked the question, what will be the social, political, and economic implications, and perhaps even democratic implications of our continued reliance on civil society to execute the work of government? We're giving them our money, we're giving them our trust. What does that mean for democracy? What does that mean for governance? Even government itself is looking to independent organizations to execute the work of governance and execute the work of dispersing funds and resources. I mean, that is literally, if anything, government is supposed to do exactly just that. Because if the answer is that no, they steal the money, then it may well be the case that we're constructing and setting up a parallel government for us, What does that look like? And is this a concern that we should have going forward? I mean, it works now, but it may become a permanent feature of our body politic. And to join me to have this conversation right now from the Rivonia Circle, the newly founded Rivonia Circle, is Gogo Londiwe Mtambo. Londiwe, thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate you joining us here on This Week Today. Joining us all the way from Durban is Spamandla Pengu. Spamandla, thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate having you here with us.
Thank you very much, Oliver.
Thanks, man. Londiwe, I'm going to start with you. At its core, what is civil society supposed to be? What do they exist for? What's their role in our democracy?
Yeah. So good evening, everyone. Thanks for welcoming me onto the show. Well, firstly, that's a big question. What is civil society's role? But fundamentally, I would say that civil society's role is to be the platform for people to be able to engage their government, to be able to engage ezinye izinto that might seem a little bit far from them. But also civil society is meant to sort of meet some of the needs that the communities have and be a platform for communities to engage amongst themselves, with government, with democracy.
I mean, and I ask you that because you work for a civil society organization. But Pamanda, you also work for a civil society organization, and you are in Durban, in KZN, where the disaster took place. How do you imagine yourself and your role as civil society in this moment? What do you see yourself to be to the community in this moment?
I think ultimately, it's a difficulty playing more of a very supportive role to the actions both of government as well as of individual communities. In this instance, I think we would be taking the lead from government in trying to help mediate instances where the government feels it might be a bit difficult or they need additional manpower. But what's clearly becoming the case is it appears as though civil society is taking more of a leading role in many instances, which I concur with you with your early sentiment around. This does feel to be a concerning trend, and it shouldn't be a trend that we should take lightly, given the nature of how sort of undemocratic some of these institutions might come about, precisely because they haven't been necessarily given a mandate from communities, as it were.
Does this mean we've given up on accountability? Does it mean we've given up on trying to hold government accountable if we're just going to be like, yeah, we're just not going to use you for anything and rely on you for anything anymore? We'll try to do this ourselves.
I think the notion of accountability in South Africa has been muddied so significantly that people don't buy into the mechanisms that exist within the state to be able to activate that accountability. If accountability is just knowing about wrongdoing, or rather, or maladministration, but we don't see any real consequence, particularly of the political actors, when wrongdoing occurs, then we don't feel that there's genuine accountability. And so there's a significant level of transparency, but we've become rather we don't necessarily see the shifts when it comes to accountability, because it's accountability without any real consequences. So a lot of the conversation in the past has been that there aren't genuine consequence management systems in place for primarily political actors that act on behalf of the state. And in the instance that they are found of wrongdoing in particular, because of the nature of our one-party dominance, at least, as one of the elements that have led us to the space where we are, those individuals or political actors haven't been held accountable in the way in which society in general would feel that people who have harmed society to that extent ought to be held accountable.
Yeah.
So you have the deployment, for instance, where individuals might be doing wrong in one portfolio, they just move to an alternate portfolio with not even a diminishing amount of power or oversight in respect of the funds that they have
often with a
access
congruent
to.
amount of power. And in the most recent instance, an increase in salary, if you look at the case of Thandi Modise being moved out and Mapisa Nqakula being moved as Speaker of Parliament. Londiwe, are we without realizing it, reimagining what democracy is, what it looks like for us and what it's supposed to be doing for us? Because, I mean, if we are, should we change how we talk to each other about democracy?
So I think the work of reimagining democracy is happening, right? I think that so the way that it then plays itself out happens in different ways. Specifically when it comes to civil society and governance and communities and governance.
Yes.
Communities, I mean, I've been doing a lot of work within communities, and what I'm finding when we're engaging with people within communities is that people are just choosing a thing that I'm calling self-governance, that they're like, well,
Right.
we'll just do it ourselves. We'll just start an NPO, we'll start a co-op, and we'll just do it ourselves. And for me, the danger of that is not that I'm against people doing work within their communities. Of course, that can happen. But what I am against is shifting the responsibility that government has, that we pay for,
Yes.
that our taxes pay for, to people, and therefore creating a separate structure that we'll just govern ourselves, right?
Yeah.
Whereas the government exists for a particular purpose, it must govern. And it can't be that there are structures that exist that are supposed to be helping people engage their democracy that just don't work, and we're just going to say, well, we're just going to do it ourselves. That's
Are
the
you
danger
worried?
for
Are
me.
you worried that this might politicize the civil society space? I mean, civil society has become in South Africa deeply politicized. I mean, you would remember the sort of things the Jacob Zuma Foundation often says about the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, for instance,
Yeah.
and what the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation would say in return to that, right? So civil society has become politicized over the last decade in South Africa, but do you fear that it might further politicize it in the way that Oliver starts a community garden because the people are hungry and government can't provide food for the people. My community garden becomes successful, and then I go and run for office on the back of the success of that civil society organization. Now the food garden is no longer a community project, because now I'm going to try and use state resources to deliver, and then I come there and I'm hamstrung by the politics of the state. And then and every time another civil society organization comes up, they're seen as a possible future contender in the electoral system, and therefore early on are ostracized or viewed with suspicion by the community, viewed with suspicion by other political players.
Look, I don't know. I myself, and even within our thinking within the Rivonia Circle, we are encouraging people to run for office, right? It cannot be that people who are already doing the work in communities, who are already community leaders, are limited in terms of engaging politics in the mainstream sense.
Right.
It's fine, abangeni, right? The problem or the danger is the kind of system abangena kuyo, right, that they're entering into. And that, I mean, we can have a whole discussion about patronage and all the things that exist within that system. I don't think that it further politicizes the civil society space, to be honest. I think the civil society space is fairly political. And I think there are different ways in which politics then play themselves out within civil society. It does not have to look like mainstream politics. It does not have to look like elections. People are doing politics and engaging politics and democracy in other ways constantly in their communities.
Spamandla, if I say to you, if I put out a call to SFM listeners and I'm like, yo, Spamandla's doing an amazing work in KZN, and he has for the last 5 or so years. He's worked with schools and communities for as long as I've known him, and now he works with building democracy and democratic institutions in KZN, and I say, and he's helping with relief right now. Here's his banking details. Everybody listening to the show, all hypothetically 100,000 of y'all, donate 100 rand to this guy. By the end of the night, you have R1 million in your bank account. You squander that money, you buy yourself a nice Jeep, you extend your house. How do I come back to the SFM listeners and hold you accountable with them?
In truth, you can't unless you're willing to take me to court and claim that you gave me money for a specific purpose and I wasn't able to do that. we already understand in this country, at least, the extent to which people feel that the justice system doesn't necessarily reflect the intentions of local communities, or at least it's difficult to access. So individual John Does, for instance, who give their money, hard-earned cash, to individual organizations, might find it very difficult to hold those organizations accountable. Because ultimately, the accountability mechanisms within organizations, primarily those who are, so there are two types of NGOs. Some are membership-based, some are non-membership-based. So the membership-based ones are to its membership, then to its executive structure, and then to its board. And in the ones that are non-membership-based, it's just to the board, and ultimately then to the taxman, because the taxman has to account for the lack of tax that you are using your money for, because you have tax breaks when you're an NGO. But for those instances, you can't hold me accountable beyond making me liable to a court of law. Even in those instances, it might be very difficult because there has to be some sort of contractual agreement about whether I agreed to use those funds directly for those things that you were talking about.
And there's no contract. I am voluntarily giving you this 100 Rand, right? There's no, I didn't sign any paperwork. So
in good faith, then you're allowing me the ability to use the money as I see fit. And I think that's the leeway that we're giving to organizations to say, we've seen you do good work in the past, and we have the trust potentially that you might continue to do that good work, but we have no guarantee.
Yes, and that's an important feature, because Londi, ultimately what drives us is that I trust NGO more. I trust Gift of the Givers. I've seen what they did, right? And I've seen them go and drill water boreholes out in Makanda, for instance, when there was no water and an entire community couldn't drink tap water. And now, you know, I give them money going forward. But what if one day that just changes? But that trust deficit that exists with the state, how does the state, and by the state I mean the arms of state, because we don't even trust Parliament to hold them to account, right? And many people don't even trust the courts, because the courts are so inundated with a heavy caseload that you can't go and sue every NGO, and especially if these are NGOs that poor people rely on, especially if these are NGOs that poor people donated to, right? We're never going to find ourselves at the High Court. We don't have the money of Sfunukwazi, for instance, or or any of these big organizations. How does the state rebuild their trust deficit? Can they at all?
Between them and citizens. Sure. I don't know. I don't know how the state can do that apart from doing their job and doing it properly. I think, at least from my experience and from my engagements with community leaders and people who are actively working within the communities, they really just want government and the state to play its role, and that's the only way that you can then start to create that trust again. I don't know if there's a quick thing that they can do right now in order for that to happen, for that trust to be back from the citizen side.
Is that trust easy to transfer? If I ran the food garden and next year I'm now the ward councillor, is that a good way of transferring good faith and trust?
You're asking me difficult questions. I think there is a certain level of transferability that trust can be transferred. But even then, I think the community will at the very least have access to you. They know you, they trust you,
and that's important.
And they know where you live. So figure what's the situation? And I think that's important. I think the disconnect between people who are meant to be doing umsebenzi of the government and of the state, the disconnect between them and abantu and them and communities, also fosters this mistrust.
Right. Yeah, we've got some calls on the line, so you can give us a call if you want to make a comment. And we prefer those WhatsApp voice notes, so 0614-104-107. If you do want to send us a WhatsApp voice note, tweet me. I also like some tweets at Oliver_speaking. Mike from Durban is on the line. Mike, you think that the money should be given to people who are responsible, no matter who they are?
Yes, give it to responsible people. We've just gone through this COVID-19 PPE scam. There are people have been appearing in court. The NPA, Shamila Batoy, is holding a lot more dockets there. The ANC appointed Mayor of Durban, Kuanda, he handed out 456 million rand to his comrades in Durban, right? Now he's going to be handling millions. He's been one of them appointed. We don't want this guy anywhere near this money. If the money said he's going to come a long way.
Who do you trust more? Who do you trust more, Mike? Do you trust the local NGO down the road from you, or do you trust your ward councillor to make the right call when you don't have water?
The what?
Do you trust the local NGO more, or do you trust your ward councillor more?
We've got an ANC ward councillor, and we've got a DA PR councillor here.
Oh, okay. Do you trust them at all?
Ward 26, which covers.
But do you trust them at all?
But the previous ward councillor in 2019, the money for the pensioners' party disappeared into the hands of the ex-mayor Gomeri to help pay for a party on Durban Beachfront. The poor pensioners never had a party.
Okay. Thank you so much for your call, Mike. Really do appreciate it. Gole from Polokwane, thank you so much for your call. You're on the line.
It's a pleasure.
Gole?
Thank you.
And can you hear me? And you on? Go ahead, sir.
This is not a matter of mistrust of the government, but it's a formal protest, a vote of no confidence to the government. Right. And the ANC in general. Look, I work for the state. It does not need a rocket science to know that the state is corrupt. And there is no consequence management. Ministers are rotated. Heads of department are moved from one department to another, or one.
How do you? Sorry, I want to pause you and ask you this: how do you process private sector corruption? I mean, we just recently read a report.
But the issue is, remember here,
billion rand of corruption in the private sector. How do you feel about that?
What I'm saying, it is not about mistrust or that overtrust of the private companies, but it's a vote of no confidence and a protest to the government to say, sort your house in order. We know that the state.
Why does that protest not reflect at the ballot box in the same way?
That is the problem. You see, South African voters, we don't know whether we still mature with time.
Right.
But we are very sophisticated. We are not a linear function. It's difficult. But if you see the trend that is starting in an urban area, accountability is starting.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate your call. Spamala, I'll give you the last minute to wrap up, and then Londiwe will give you a last minute to wrap up. Final thoughts?
Yeah, I think just in general, as a last sort of, I think it's important that we consider the available mechanisms for accountability in government and think about whether it's enough for us to run away from government in totality or try to reform the available accountability mechanisms.
Yeah.
Of course, it's going to require that the state comes on board and is at least willing to work with us in one way or the other. At the moment, it does feel as though knocking on different institutions as well as doors that are related to the state and government is quite difficult. And the work that we're doing as NGOs on the side, we must also consider the potential negative impact that we might have on the existing state mechanisms and whether they or not they work. There's been a number of studies conducted, for instance, in Northern Africa, that there's the potential, for instance, with health, study was related to health workers in particular, that for instance, in some instances, NGOs paid more than government, and therefore there was the run-on. So government lost significant talent in that respect.
Wow.
But beyond that, in instances where there were government health services being provided in that area, and you found NGOs trying to replicate that, the quality provided by government continue to win as a result of a level of complacency, because now Spamandla is available to do it, and therefore we don't need to change our ways as it were.
Yeah. Londiwe, last comment. Is that the reason why, Londiwe, you work for Rivonia Circle and not make your master's use in government?
So, I mean, part of the work that I do with Rivonia Circle is about thinking through political culture. I don't think that it's fair to say that the vote of no confidence that our caller was talking about is not reflecting in the ballot box. I think that it is. The amount of people who are not showing up for the ballot box tell us that there's a vote of no confidence. The amount, I mean, if you look at KZN as a case study, the amount of people who won or got into the ward councillors as based on issues rather than parties. The amount of individuals who got into council based on issues. The smaller parties who are talking about issues rather than the sort of bigger, political conversations that we've seen in South Africa in the past are showing us that vote of no confidence. I think that that's clear. I think that the political culture in South Africa is shifting, and that's why I work with Rivonia Circle and the work that we do with Rivonia Circle.
Spamandla Bengu, thank you so much for your time. Londiwe Tambo, thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. On the other side of this, we talk about the implication, or at least how to deal with the epidemiological threat of this fifth wave and the resurgence of COVID-19 cases in the absence of a disaster management framework to rely on to make sense of what the appropriate reaction will be. For that conversation, I'm joined by Professor Adrian Purin, the Executive Director of the NICD, as well as Professor Vardas, who's a clinical virologist with Lancet. That conversation on the other side of this.
If you're active on social media and love SAFM, we hope you'll take a moment to like or follow our SAFM page on Facebook and Twitter. These are the best places to find all the guest information, conversations, and stories you love from your favorite presenters, along with regular updates from SABC News. And don't forget, you can send your questions to feedback@safm.co.za. SAFM, leading the conversation. SAFM has signed a code of conduct that is enforced by the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. Under the code, we are committed to giving news that is accurate, comment that is fair, and programming that is not harmful, does not amount to hate speech, or contain violence or explicit sex. If you think we are not living up to that code, then you can inform the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. Direct any complaints in writing to the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. PO Box 142365. Craig Hall 2024. Fax to 011-326-3198 or an email to bccsa@nabsa.co.za. For more information, please visit www.bccsa.co.za.
Oliver Dickson on SAFM. SAFM values your views. Be an active citizen.
We get delayed. And then when we've been drinking, I'm ordering a ride. It's only 180 rand.
Yeah, so?
Or do you want to spend the weekend in jail? Yeah?
No.
Or end up in an emergency room but live with one leg? Do you know the price of tombstones, Joe? Is that what you want your mother to go through?
Those are actually facts, my friend.
Exactly.
Getting behind the wheel after drinking has more consequences than you think. That's why, as SAB, we're asking you to make the wise choice. Have none for the road and be sharp.
SAFM Sunrise.
Coming from the Minister, 103,000 people employed in the trucking industry, 8,500 of them are foreign nationals. Do you accept those figures?
Stephen, it is just unfortunate that the figures that they are mentioning, they are not correct. Looking back 15 years ago, we did assure the truck drivers that it was not intentional to hire foreign drivers. It is because they came looking for employment, and we realized later that some of them are undocumented and some of them came here to arrive as visitors but ended up employed. So the figures it is impossible to get the correct figure because they're not regulated. So therefore, you don't even know the companies that are registered in South Africa in the trucking industry.
Mary Paddy, thank you very much indeed. The view from her, the president of the Truckers Association.
First in the morning, SAFM Sunrise with Stephen Grootes. Oliver Dickson on SAFM.
It is 20 minutes to the top of the hour, 7 p.m. It's a Friday. You are listening to This Week Today. My name is Oliver Dickson, and I'm with you until the top of the hour. In this part of the show, we're going to have a conversation, and critically important, about the resurgence of COVID-19 with a sharp spike in positive cases and an increase in the positivity test rate in the country. Wow, that tripped me up a little bit. But the big question here is, how do we deal with the epidemiological threat of the fifth wave, if there's a threat at all, in the absence of a framework to deal with it as we have in the past, that is to say, without a Disaster Management Act with 5 levels upon which we can fall on. We are at the moment under a Disaster Management Act, national state of disaster, but for an entirely different reason other than COVID. And to join me for this conversation is Professor Adrian Purin, Executive Director with the NICD, as well as Professor Vardas, who's a clinical virologist with Lancet. Professor Adrian, let's maybe start here. Is there a epidemiological threat that we need to be alert of, or is the resurgence of COVID-19 cases for the most part innocuous?
I wouldn't say it's innocuous. I think it's really critical that we keep track of what's actually happening with regard to the cases. So you've mentioned, for example, the positivity rate certainly is on the increase, certainly. However, when we look at the 7-day moving average, there's no real evidence of dramatic changes around that. And if you look at our hospitalizations and deaths, I know that these are lag indicators, but again, there's no dramatic changes. But yes, certainly, we need to keep track of these particular indicators. I know, again, in terms of our wastewater surveillance, there's certainly evidence, again, that there's an increase in Omicron in circulation. So I think these indicators certainly showing an upward trajectory, but not a dramatic change at this time. I know the focus is a lot on cases, but I think that our emphasis really needs to change around that particular matter, given, as we've seen with Omicron, that there was this dissociation between cases which can be extraordinarily large, but in fact, in terms of the specific outcomes with regard to severe disease and hospitalizations was very different. So I think, but still, we need to keep track of that, as well as the variants as well. As well as really going to be critical for us.
There are a myriad of indices that we look at, but which one of these indices are most critical for us to scale just how impactful the wave might be in terms of death and hospitalization and severe illness? Which of those indicators matter most?
Yeah, so I think the ascertainment of cases, it will give us some idea of the trajectory, but I think it's really around the hospitalizations, oxygen utilization, bed capacity, our deaths. These are certainly some of the key indicators, again, in terms of if you're referring to a framework that I think will be really important for us to keep track on specifically.
Professor Vardas, I'd like to bring you into the conversation here. Do we have conclusive data to support the idea, at least the premise under which government has been operating in response to the pandemic? Do we have enough data to support the idea that a restriction, and perhaps in many cases, a excessive restriction in movement is effective in dealing with test positivity rates going up and new cases coming up?
Well, I think we're in a different part of the pandemic at the moment. Initially, we had the lockdowns to prevent overwhelming of the health infrastructure. Certainly, also to prevent the transmission of COVID. Then, at the moment, we're in a different sort of place, because we have got some level of immunity from people being exposed naturally to the virus, as well as vaccination, which has been really the most important thing that is putting us in a place where we are not as on the back foot and worried about people getting severely ill. So people are getting ill, and we know that, and we have been watching the positivity rate increase over the last couple of weeks, in fact. So it's not just Easter that caused this. But we are not as frightened, because the other metrics that Professor Purin spoke about, the hospitals are not full, the oxygen utilization is not being pressurized. So do we need a lockdown? we probably do not need a lockdown, and the lockdown would be inappropriate at this point of the pandemic. What we do need is clear instruction on how to prevent transmission, which is using of masks in public places, restricting the size of events, as well as making sure that people continue with social distancing in environments indoors. So those are important, but most important, of course, is making sure that you have got some protection, which is with vaccination.
Just to that around non-pharmaceutical interventions that we need to message quite clearly to people, right? Some of the pharmaceutical interventions are quite clear. People need to get vaccinated. And that will help us with immunity. But do we still chase the idea of herd immunity that was so important and critical at the start of this? 66% was the number in South Africa when I remember the president making that announcement that that's our target. Or do we have enough immunity as it stands?
We don't have enough immunity. And so numbers being passed around that people have been exposed, 80% of people have been exposed, and therefore we needn't worry, is really actually misleading. What we need to understand is that they might have been exposed, but that is not necessarily protective immunity. And so vaccination can give you protective immunity, and that's the way that we need to be addressing the problem at the moment. I don't think we need to stop, and we shouldn't be stopping the non-pharmaceutical interventions. And, I'm sure everybody is confused because people are giving different information and different bits of information at the moment. Do not rest on your laurels because 80% of people have been exposed in some studies. That does not mean that we must stop our interventions. And quite frankly, I think that our best bet at the moment, we should be vaccinating, but as we wait for vaccination or accessing the vaccination and making sure that it's working, we should be using non-pharmaceutical interventions.
Is it enough for someone, Dr. Vardas, to say, well, I had COVID 8 months ago. Surely I've built up enough immunity and I don't need to go and get vaccinated. Does immunity, we were told when we started learning about COVID that immunity seems to expire, natural immunity, that is, if you've contracted the virus before. Is that a belief we can hold on to?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen this repeatedly over different studies that immunity, even after vaccination, does also decrease over time. And so that's why we're talking about repeated vaccination and booster vaccination. So that's important. After a natural infection, you're immune to that particular virus that infected you. So you're not immune to any of the other variants. And I think that the vaccination might help you with that as well. So it does decrease over time, and you should be boosting your vaccination, your immunity with vaccination.
Professor Purin, non-pharmaceutical interventions require a level of compliance by the people, right? And let's be honest, South Africa is not a very compliant country. At least we don't have a strong culture of compliance in South Africa when it comes to social distancing, mask wearing, and all of that sort of stuff. And therefore, almost always have to be state mandated through some sort of gazetting of a regulation or a law, whatever the case may be. Professor Varda says it would be irresponsible to enact any sort of restrictions and lockdown at this moment. How will we know when we get to a moment where we need to strongly reconsider the reinstitution of some of those restrictions?
I think that some of those restrictions, will not really necessarily be brought back, in other words, such as the lockdowns, because I think we know that the lockdowns really have not really been successful. I think it's really looking at those non-pharmaceutical interventions, as you've mentioned. And there certainly are regulations. In fact, the regulations with regard to the workplaces, for example, again, it's pretty clear what needs to be done to ensure the safety of people at work. And you have to go through risk assessments, you have to look, and it does list quite clearly things such as wearing the masks, physical distancing, and something which we don't really often talk about, but it certainly is also around ventilation, for example. Again, right. It's really clear that all these elements are considered, and they have been documented, and it is gazetted what is expected of, for example, an employer and an employee to certainly work on. So again, I know that there's still a great deal of discussion around vaccine mandate, but even there, it is gazetted that if you are going to have a mandate, then you need to follow the following steps. But if you're not going to have vaccines, if you're not going to mandate it, then you need to follow the following steps. So I think it's clear, at least in terms of workplaces and other places of education, for example, that the approach around non-pharmaceutical interventions is pretty obvious.
Yeah.
clear how we should be doing that. But it comes back to compliance.
Absolutely.
Again, and I think there's also nuanced approaches to this. I think, we talk about indoor mask wearing, for example, versus outdoor, but even outdoor, I think you need, as FT here has stated quite clearly, if you have large crowds close together in the outdoor settings without masking, again, those are high risk settings again. So I think it's all managing your risk, but I agree that we need the guidance. In other words, there needs to be clear guidance rather than you as an individual always trying to work out, well, what are my risks? I think you should still be doing that, but if there's clear guidance as to what to be done, I think that will certainly help individuals.
And we don't necessarily need a lockdown framework or a Disaster Management Act framework for that guidance to be communicated.
Absolutely, and I think we've done that. I think in terms of the current level 1, we certainly have removed that now. But if you look at those scenarios where we did have large numbers of cases, we didn't really need a lockdown, essentially because we could manage and control that. And given the current variant that was in circulation did not affect, again, looking at those key indicators such as hospitalization, severe disease, and deaths, we certainly were able to manage our hospital capacity. And I think that's going to be key, is really the preparedness. Again, that hospitals are prepared in terms of their bed capacity, oxygen supplies, making sure their staff are also protected in the sense of ensuring that they have the PPEs, are vaccinated. If they're not vaccinated, what needs to be done under those particular circumstances. So I think there are things that we can and must be doing now, prior to being hit with a large number of cases entering our wards.
Yeah. Professor Varas, I'll give you the last minute here. That's all we have left. Professor Purin speaks about a set of protocols that must be in place, right? What to be done in hospitals, for instance, for a vaccinated patient, unvaccinated patient, and all of that sort of stuff, managing our risk by having clear guidance on what to do as individuals and as institutions, hospital, workplaces, and all of that sort of stuff. But for that to be clear, we need to know just how severe the risk may be, and quite a bit of that is informed by the virological impact of whatever the variant may be of the time. And I know it might be too early for you to give us a conclusive answer here, but what does the data tell us about the epidemiological threat that we're dealing with here? Is it just the Omicron that we're used to? Is it a subvariant? Is it one of the subvariants that were recently identified? Or is it a mixture of different variants all put together?
So at the moment, we've got Omicron and a few of its subvariants at the moment. So that's good news in the sense that we know that Omicron has got a relatively milder disease. That doesn't mean that no disease is occurring, and we are seeing really a spike in cases that is worrying. Is this the fifth wave? I don't know. I can't answer that question. But certainly we are percent positivity. So the number of tests that we are doing in private is at more or less the same level as it was at the beginning of the year. But our percent positivity has actually doubled. So we really are worried about that. It is likely Omicron. And we are doing surveillance. All of the labs are doing surveillance, both private and public, and we know it's Omicron. But that doesn't mean, again, that we shouldn't be worried. It is worrying.
Absolutely. Professor Purin, Professor Vardas, thank you so much for your time on the program. Really do appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. On the other side of this, we talk about the French election. How important is this election for geopolitical peace around the world, especially in the global north, where Russia is at war with Ukraine? And what does that mean for the global south? South Africa has an important trade relation with France. What will the impact of this outcome of the election be on that particular relationship? That conversation's coming up right after this.
SAFM has signed a code of conduct that is enforced by the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. Under the code, we are committed to giving news that is accurate, comment that is fair, and programming that is not harmful, does not amount to hate speech, or contain violence or explicit sex. If you think we are not living up to that code, then you can inform the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. Direct any complaints in writing to the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. PO Box 142365. Craig Hall 2024. Fax to 011-326-3198 or an email to bccsa@nabsa.co.za. For more information, please visit www.bccsa.co.za. If If you're active on social media and love SAFM, we hope you'll take a moment to like or follow our SAFM page on Facebook and Twitter. These are the best places to find all the guest information, conversations, and stories you love from your favorite presenters, along with regular updates from SABC News. And don't forget, you can send your questions to feedback@safm.co.za. SAFM, leading the conversation.
This week, today, with Oliver Dickson.
There's about 5 minutes to the top of the hour in this last segment of the show. We're going to be talking about the French election, just for you to have an understanding of what's going on and why it may be of importance. There are two candidates at loggerheads over there. It's Marianne Perrine, or known as Marine Le Pen, sometimes referred to by her initials, MLP. That's such a cool name to have. She's a far-right candidate, and Emmanuel Macron has always been thought of the more liberal candidate, although he really is a centrist if you take a good look at his politics. Marine Le Pen, promising some very deep reforms in a debate 2 nights ago, things such as banning, for instance, Muslim women from wearing the hijab when they're in public. What does that mean for French society? But more importantly, what does this mean for international relations and geopolitical peace? And how do we make sense of that? Joining us for this conversation is Lieza Junbag. I hope I said your surname correctly, Lieza. Good evening and welcome to the show. Let's start with what's going on in France. How important is this election in relation and relative to past elections in France, especially given what's going on in Europe at the moment with Russia and Ukraine at loggerheads?
Good evening, and thank you for having me. Obviously, every election is important, and we always think that the current election is more important than the ones that have come before it. But currently, it is a very important election. It's essentially testing this idea between what is the culture of France? Who do they see themselves as the identity of France? And that obviously is important in terms of how voters vote, in terms of what's being promised. You see Marine Le Pen, and she's very much seen as a right-wing candidate, very favorable in terms of Putin. She's had very favorable things to say about Putin before. Obviously, she's walked a lot of those back now that we've had the current conflict in the Ukraine. But it really is a question of how far right is France going to swing? What does that mean for the identity of France, both religious as well as in terms of how they treat immigrants, as terms of who is French? All of this is considered to be, being tested in this election.
Would it be fair to describe Marine Le Pen as the Donald Trump of France?
I think, perhaps not quite as outlandish as Donald Trump sometimes has been in the past, but certainly, similar political views. She has expressed admiration for Donald Trump in the past, and would be more along the lines of, say, Donald Trump, Bolsonaro, Putin, in her rightward leaning, certainly more so than Macron would be. Yeah,
France has become increasingly more popular and influential in the European Union as a member state there, and has done a lot, and its membership has done a lot for what we dub Francophone Africa, with a lot of the aid that has been directed in that direction. Mali, for instance, being a country benefiting from that and finding it now in a precarious position because it wouldn't distance itself from Russia quite explicitly. How important then will a right swing be for the global South's relationship with France, particularly Africa?
So it's actually a very interesting question, because what we're currently seeing in Africa is actually a questioning of these former relationships, these relationships with former colonial powers. And that's certainly been very evident in West Africa recently. There's been a lot of contestation as to whether or not they actually want French involvement in their politics. Certainly in the former Francophone colonies, France has always been fairly active as an actor post-colonial sort of times, and as you mentioned, has provided funding, peacekeeping, in many cases mediation and brokering. But what's interesting is that we've seen a swing away from this, and in some countries, in fact, a swing towards Russia seen as a more honest broker. So it's not a clear-cut picture, but all of that was before Russia invaded Ukraine, which has now again changed up the political picture. So certainly from a global south perspective, Marine Le Pen is not the favoured candidate. Macron, better the devil you know, and as you mentioned before, he's fairly centrist. So he's seen as being sort of more accommodating in terms of African and other, immigrants, more accommodating in terms of religious freedom, and
Absolutely.
certainly would be the preferable candidate.
Absolutely. Dr. Jernberg, how do I say your name, Doctor? Your surname?
It's Lisa Jernberg.
Jernberg, right. Thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it, Dr. Lisa Jernberg, giving us analysis on the French election. And that's it for today's show. Thank you so much for your company. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you do want to listen back to any of the conversations we have had on the show, it's up on YouTube. Just go to the YouTube channel, SAFM Radio. It was streamed live and you can listen back to those conversations. They're available right now. It will be up on the SAFM podcasting platforms as well. And you can tweet me if you want to engage any further in any of these conversations. It is at Oliver_speaking on Twitter, Oliver Dickson on Facebook. My name is Oliver Dickson, and thank you so much for your company. Up next is sports.
Independent and impartial. This is SAFM News.
The top story is Asawa, an arrest over the rape of an Eastern Cape teen, and the new Zulu King's coronation is postponed. A very good evening. Please note that the following story contains some graphic details which may offend some sensitive listeners, including children. Police say a suspect has been arrested for the rape of a 15-year-old girl at a Kabazana village in Mount Aleph in the Eastern Cape. The girl was dragged into a forested area, raped, and her eyes gouged out a week ago. The 23-year-old man is due to appear in the Mount Aleph Magistrates Court on Monday, facing charges of rape and assault with the intent to cause critical bodily harm. Provincial Police Commissioner Nomtheteleli Mene.
I welcome the arrest of the 23-year-old suspect who is implicated